Hello. My name is Jem and I'm from Spain. I am a teacher. I work with young children. In my free time, I like to read books and cook Spanish food for my family. At the weekend, I enjoy meeting friends. We often visit museums and sometimes go to concerts. Language is our major means of communication. It is how we share our thoughts with others. A language's secondary purpose is to convey someone's sentiments, emotions, or attitudes. English is one such language in the world that satisfies both the above purposes. English has been regarded as the first global lingua franca. It has become part and parcel of almost every existing field. We use it as the international language to communicate in many fields ranging from business to entertainment. Many countries teach and encourage youngsters to acquire English as a second language. Even in nations where English is not an official language, many science and engineering curriculum are written in English. A railway line was being constructed in our neighborhood. On the eve of feast days, the streets were thronged with ragged fellows whom the townspeople called navvies, and of whom they were afraid. And more than once I had seen one of these tatterdemalions with a blood-stained countenance being led to the police station, while a samovar or some linen, wet from the wash, was carried behind by way of material evidence. The navvies usually congregated about the taverns and the marketplace. They drank, ate, and used bad language, and pursued with shrill whistles every woman of light behavior who passed by. To entertain this hungry rabble, our shopkeepers made cats and dogs drunk with vodka, or tied an old kerosene can to a dog's tail. A hue and cry was raised, and the dog dashed along the street, jingling the can, squealing with terror. It fancied some monster was close upon its heels. It would run far out of the town into the open country and there sink exhausted. There were in the town several dogs who went about trembling with their tails between their legs. And people said this diversion had been too much for them, and had driven them mad. A station was being built 4 miles from the town. It was said that the engineers asked for a bribe of 50,000 rubles for bringing the line right up to the town. But the town council would only consent to give 40,000. They could not come to an agreement over the difference. And now the townspeople regretted it, as they had to make a road to the station and that, it was reckoned, would cost more. The sleepers and rails had been laid throughout the whole length of the line, and trains ran up and down it, bringing building materials and laborers. And further progress was only delayed on account of the bridges which Dalzikov was building, and some of the stations were not yet finished. Dubechnia, as our first station was called, was a little under 12 miles from the town. I walked. The cornfields, bathed in the morning sunshine, were bright green. It was a flat, cheerful country, and in the distance there were the distinct outlines of the station, of ancient barrows, and far-away homesteads. How nice it was out there in the open! And how I longed to be filled with the sense of freedom, if only for that one morning. That I might not think of what was being done in the town, not think of my needs, not feel hungry. Nothing has so marred my existence as an acute feeling of hunger, which made images of buckwheat porridge, rissoles, and baked fish mingle strangely with my best thoughts. Here I was standing alone in the open country, gazing upward at a lark which hovered in the air at the same spot, trilling as though in hysterics, and meanwhile I was thinking, how nice it would be to eat a piece of bread and butter. Or I would sit down by the roadside to rest, and shut my eyes to listen to the delicious sounds of May, and what haunted me was the smell of hot potatoes. Though I was tall and strongly built, I had as a rule little to eat, and so the predominant sensation throughout the day was hunger. And perhaps that was why I knew so well how it is that such multitudes of people toil merely for their daily bread, and can talk of nothing but things to eat. At Dubechnia they were plastering the inside of the station, and building a wooden upper story to the pumping shed. It was hot, there was a smell of lime, and the workmen sauntered listlessly between the heaps of shavings and mortar rubble. The pointsman lay asleep near his sentry box, and the sun was blazing full on his face. There was not a single tree. The telegraph wire hummed faintly and hawks were perching on it here and there. I, wandering, too, among the heaps of rubbish, and not knowing what to do, recalled how the engineer, in answer to my question what my duties would consist in, had said, "We shall see when you are there," but what could one see in that wilderness? The plasterer spoke of the foreman, and of a certain Fyodot Vasilyev. I did not understand, and gradually I was overcome by depression. The physical depression in which one is conscious of one's arms and legs and huge body, and does not know what to do with them or where to put them. After I had been walking about for at least a couple of hours, I noticed that there were telegraph poles running off to the right from the station, and that they ended a mile or a mile and a half away at a white stone wall. The workman told me the office was there, and at last I reflected that that was where I ought to go. It was a very old manor house, deserted long ago. The wall round it, of porous white stone, was mouldering and had fallen away in places, and the lodge, the blank wall of which looked out on the open country, had a rusty roof with patches of tin plate gleaming here and there on it. Within the gates could be seen a spacious courtyard overgrown with rough weeds, and an old manor house with sunblind on the windows, and a high roof red with rust. Two lodges, exactly alike, stood one on each side of the house to right and to left. One had its windows nailed up with boards, near the other, of which the windows were open. There was washing on the line, and there were cabs moving about. The last of the telegraph poles stood in the courtyard, and the wire from it ran to the window of the lodge, of which the blank wall looked out into the open country. The door stood open, I went in. By the telegraph apparatus a gentleman with a curly dark head, wearing a reefer coat made of sailcloth, was sitting at a table. He glanced at me morosely from under his brows, but immediately smiled and said, Hello, better than nothing. It was Ivan Cheprikov, an old schoolfellow of mine, who had been expelled from the second class for smoking. We used at one time, during autumn, to catch goldfinches, finches, and linnets together, and to sell them in the market early in the morning, while our parents were still in their beds. We watched for flocks of migrating starlings and shot at them with small shot, then we picked up those that were wounded, and some of them died in our hands in terrible agonies. I remember to this day how they moaned in the cage at night. Those that recovered we sold, and swore with the utmost effrontery that they were all cocks. On one occasion at the market I had only one starling left, which I had offered to purchasers in vain, till at last I sold it for a farthing. Anyway, it's better than nothing, I said to comfort myself, as I put the farthing in my pocket. And from that day the street urchins and the schoolboys called after me, better than nothing, and to this day the street boys and the shopkeepers mock at me with the nickname, though no one remembers how it arose. Cheprikov was not of robust constitution. He was narrow-chested, round-shouldered, and long-legged. He wore a silk cord for a tie, had no trace of a waistcoat, and his boots were worse than mine, with the heels trodden down on one side. He stared, hardly even blinking, with a strained expression, as though he were just going to catch something, and he was always in a fuss. "You wait a minute," he would say fussily. "You listen. Whatever was I talking about?" We got into conversation. I learned that the estate on which I now was had until recently been the property of the Cheprikovs, and had only the autumn before passed into the possession of Dolzhikov, who considered it more profitable to put his money into land than to keep it in notes, and had already bought up 3 good-sized mortgaged estates in our neighborhood. At the sale Cheprikov's mother had reserved for herself the right to live for the next 2 years in one of the lodges at the side, and had obtained a post for her son in the office. "I should think he could buy," Cheprikov said of the engineer. "See what he fleeces out of the contractors alone. He fleeces everyone." Then he took me to dinner, deciding fussily that I should live with him in the lodge, and have my meals from his mother. "She is a bit stingy," he said, "but she won't charge you much." It was very cramped in the little rooms in which his mother lived. They were all, even the passage and the entry, piled up with furniture which had been brought from the big house after the sale, and the furniture was all old-fashioned mahogany. Madame Cheprikov, a very stout middle-aged lady with slanting Chinese eyes, was sitting in a big armchair by the window, knitting a stocking. She received me ceremoniously. "This is Poloznev, Mama," Cheprikov introduced me. "He is going to serve here." "Are you a nobleman?" she asked in a strange, disagreeable voice. It seemed to me to sound as though fat were bubbling in her throat. "Yes," I answered. "Sit down." The dinner was a poor one. Nothing was served but pies filled with bitter curd, and milk soup. Elena Nikiforovna, who presided, kept blinking in a queer way, first with one eye and then with the other. She talked, she ate, but yet there was something deathly about her whole figure, and one almost fancied the faint smell of a corpse. There was only a glimmer of life in her, a glimmer of consciousness that she had been a lady who had once had her own serfs. That she was the widow of a general whom the servants had to address as Your Excellency, and when these feeble relics of life flickered up in her for an instant she would say to her son, "Jean, you are not holding your knife properly." Or she would say to me, drawing a deep breath, with the mincing air of a hostess trying to entertain a visitor, "You know we have sold our estate. Of course, it is a pity, we are used to the place, but Dolzhikov has promised to make Jean station-master of Dubechnia, so we shall not have to go away. We shall live here at the station, and that is just the same as being on our own property. The engineer is so nice. Don't you think he is very handsome?" Until recently the Cheprakovs had lived in a wealthy style, but since the death of the general everything had been changed. Elena Nikiforovna had taken to quarreling with the neighbors, to going to law, and to not paying her bailiffs or her laborers. She was in constant terror of being robbed, and in some 10 years Dubechnia had become unrecognizable. Behind the great house was an old garden which had already run wild, and was overgrown with rough weeds and bushes. I walked up and down the veranda, which was still solid and beautiful. Through the glass doors one could see a room with parquet floor, probably the drawing room, an old-fashioned piano and pictures in deep mahogany frames. There was nothing else. In the old flower beds all that remained were peonies and poppies, which lifted their white and bright red heads above the grass. Young maples and elms, already nibbled by the cows, grew beside the paths, drawn up and hindering each other's growth. The garden was thickly overgrown and seemed impassable. But this was only near the house where there stood poplars, fir trees, and old lime trees, all of the same age, relics of the former avenues. Further on, beyond them the garden had been cleared for the sake of hay, and here it was not moist and stuffy. And there were no spiders' webs in one's mouth and eyes. A light breeze was blowing. The further one went the more open it was, and here in the open space were cherries, plums, and spreading apple trees, disfigured by props and by canker, and pear trees so tall that one could not believe they were pear trees. This part of the garden was let to some shopkeepers of the town, and it was protected from thieves and starlings by a feeble-minded peasant who lived in a shanty in it. The garden, growing more and more open, till it became definitely a meadow, sloped down to the river, which was overgrown with green weeds and osiers. Near the mill dam was the mill pond, deep and full of fish. A little mill with a thatched roof was working away with a wrathful sound, and frogs croaked furiously. Circles passed from time to time over the smooth, mirror-like water, and the water lilies trembled, stirred by the lively fish. On the further side of the river was the little village Dubechnia. The still, blue mill pond was alluring with its promise of coolness and peace. And now all this, the mill pond and the mill and the snug-looking banks, belonged to the engineer. And so my new work began. I received and forwarded telegrams, wrote various reports, and made fair copies of the notes of requirements, the complaints, and the reports sent to the office by the illiterate foremen and workmen. But for the greater part of the day I did nothing but walk about the room waiting for telegrams, or made a boy sit in the lodge while I went for a walk in the garden, until the boy ran to tell me that there was a tapping at the operating machine. I had dinner at Madame Cheprakov's. Meat we had very rarely, our dishes were all made of milk, and Wednesdays and Fridays were fast days. And on those days we had pink plates which were called Lenten plates. Madame Cheprakov was continually blinking, it was her invariable habit, and I always felt ill at ease in her presence. As there was not enough work in the lodge for one, Cheprakov did nothing, but simply dozed, or went with his gun to shoot ducks on the millpond. In the evenings he drank too much in the village or the station, and before going to bed stared in the looking-glass and said, "Hello, Ivan Cheprakov." When he was drunk he was very pale, and kept rubbing his hands and laughing with a sound like a neigh, he. By way of bravado he used to strip and run about the country naked. He used to eat flies and say they were rather sour. It's not so easy for many people, right? Because maybe you don't have any native English speakers in your city. Maybe there are no tourists that you can go and harass. Maybe there are no groups where you can go and chat and do English, speak English. When you want to learn English, you need to have motivation to use English every day. Thank you so much for watching video.
Your warm welcome to Writing Hand English Merle Writing Hand. To learn English, listening skill is the most important of a language. At first, we can't get native speakers' speech, but if we start listening to these short English stories, it will help us a lot and build our confidence so much. To practice English listening skills, our channel will help you to grow your English learning and listening skills, and also make you learn pronunciation like native speaker. You'll find a variety of content including stories and more. You will easily practice English including listening skills, speaking skills, vocabulary, grammar and tips. Hope you will support our channel by liking thumbs up, commenting Writing Hand, sharing out box tray and subscribing bell to the channel. Thank you very much. Never stop learning English.